The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel in Seoul blazed under 1,000 crystal lights. White orchids lined every aisle. Baek Deun stood at the altar in a black tuxedo, his jaw locked, minutes from marrying a woman he did not love. The organ began to play. Then the ballroom doors burst open. Adiz Nwosu walked in, 10 years older, 10 years stronger, holding the hands of 2 children whose dark gray eyes were identical to his. Every guest fell silent. The bride's champagne glass shattered against the marble floor. 10 years ago, she signed a single piece of paper and vanished with a secret he was never meant to discover. Please like, share and subscribe. Also, comment where you're watching from so I know how far across the world my story has gone. 10 years earlier, the office on the 42nd floor of Beck Global Holdings was silent except for the low hum of Seoul's skyline pressing against floor-to-ceiling glass. Rain streaked the windows in silver threads. The city below looked like a circuit board drowning in light. Adiz Nwosu sat across from a desk carved from a single slab of black marble. Her hands rested in her lap. Her spine was straight. Her face betrayed nothing, though something inside her chest was fracturing in ways she would not allow anyone in this building to witness. The termination papers lay between them. 3 pages. Standard corporate language. Immediate effect. Non-disclosure clause. Severance attached. She read every word. Behind the desk, Baek Deun did not look at her. He was reviewing a shipping manifest on his tablet, his dark gray eyes scanning columns of numbers with the same detached precision he applied to everything in his life. He was 28 then. Already feared. Already untouchable. The dragon tattoo coiling from behind his left ear down to his collarbone was hidden beneath the collar of his black dress shirt, but its presence was felt the way heat is felt from a fire you cannot see. Sign on the last page, he said. His voice was low. Measured. The kind of voice that made experienced men in underground syndicates lower their eyes. Adiz picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake. She would not give him that. She would not give this room, this building, or this man the satisfaction of watching her break. She signed her name in clean, deliberate strokes. Adiz Nwosu. The ink dried almost instantly. Deun finally looked up. His silver-gray eyes met her warm brown ones, and for a fraction of a second, so brief it could have been imagined, something flickered behind his expression. Something that might have been hesitation. Something that might have been regret. Then it was gone. Your severance will be processed by Friday, he said. Security will escort you out. Adiz stood. She smoothed the front of her cream blouse. She picked up her bag. And as she turned toward the door, her left hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to her stomach. She pressed her palm flat against the fabric of her skirt for exactly 2 seconds. A gesture so small, so quiet that Deun did not notice it. He was already looking back at his tablet. She walked out of the office. She walked out of the building. She walked into the Seoul rain without an umbrella, and she did not look back. She did not tell him. She did not tell him that the severance package would not cover the cost of what was growing inside her. She did not tell him that the pregnancy test she had taken 3 mornings ago in the fluorescent bathroom of her tiny apartment in Itaewon had come back positive. She did not tell him that the doctor had used the word twins, with a surprised smile, as though it were a blessing rather than a sentence she would now have to serve alone. She told no one. Within a week, Adiz Nwosu boarded a flight from Incheon to Lagos with a single suitcase and a secret that would reshape the next decade of 2 continents. Seoul disappeared behind the clouds. Deun never asked where she went. 10 years passed. 10 years of empire building. 10 years of blood and silence. 10 years of Deun ascending through the ranks of the Baek Syndicate until the name itself became a whisper that closed restaurants and emptied streets in Gangnam. He absorbed rival territories. He eliminated threats with surgical precision. He buried his emotions so deep beneath layers of discipline and control that even Kwon Hae-sung, his closest friend and right-hand man, sometimes wondered if there was anything left underneath. The tattoos told the only story he allowed. The Korean tiger roaring across his right forearm. The mountain landscape at dawn on his left. The prayer beads wrapping both wrists like shackles. The ancient Hanja calligraphy burned into his skin reading "Blood Remembers." The word loyal tattooed across his right knuckles. Silence across his left. He lived by those words. He ruled by them. And now, at 38, the final piece of his empire's architecture was falling into place. The Yoon Alliance. The morning of the wedding, Deun stood in the presidential suite of the Shilla Hotel, staring at his reflection in a gilded mirror. His black tuxedo was tailored to the millimeter. His platinum cufflinks caught the morning light. His hair was slicked back with absolute precision, not a single strand out of place. His jaw was clean-shaven, sharp enough to cut glass. He looked like a king preparing for his coronation. You felt nothing. The Yoon patriarch arrived an hour ago, Kwon Hae-sung said from the doorway. Hae-sung leaned against the frame, his dark suit unbuttoned, the thin scar above his left eyebrow creasing as he frowned. He's already drinking. That's never a good sign. Let him drink, Deon said. His voice was the same low, controlled instrument it had been a decade ago. Time had not softened him. It had hardened him into something closer to stone. Hae-sung hesitated. He had known Do-yoon since they were boys fighting in the back alleys of Busan. He knew the difference between Do-yoon's silence and Do-yoon's stillness. One was strategy. The other was suppression. You don't have to do this, Hae-sung said quietly. Do-yoon's eyes shifted to the mirror. His reflection stared back, cold, gray, unreadable. The Yoon ports give us control of every shipping lane from Incheon to Jeju, he said. The marriage secures the alliance. The alliance secures the territory. The territory secures the future. And what about you? Hae-sung asked. What secures you? Do-yoon adjusted his cufflinks. I don't require securing. Hae-sung said nothing more. He had learned, over the years, that pushing Do-yoon on matters of the heart was like pressing your hand against a blade. You only bled for the effort. Downstairs, the grand ballroom was a cathedral of white and gold. 300 guests filled the space. Crime family patriarchs, corporate executives, politicians whose names appeared in newspapers and whose sins appeared in police files that had been quietly destroyed. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. White orchids cascaded from every surface. A string quartet played softly near the altar. Yoon Seo-ah stood in the bridal suite on the second floor, staring at her own reflection. Her long straight black hair fell like silk against her porcelain skin. Her dress was a masterpiece of pale ivory lace, delicate and expensive. Her expression was composed, elegant, and entirely hollow. She knew this was not a love match. She had known since she was 16 and her father first mentioned the Beck family name at dinner with the casual tone of a man discussing a real estate acquisition. She was a daughter of the Yoon syndicate. Her purpose was strategic. Her feelings were irrelevant. She picked up her champagne glass and took a slow sip. 5 minutes, her attendant whispered. Seo-ah nodded. She set the glass down on the vanity. Her hand was perfectly steady. In the ballroom the guests took their seats. The air thickened with perfume, power, and the unspoken tension that always accompanied gatherings of people who controlled Seoul's underworld. Do-yoon took his position at the altar. His hands clasped behind his back. His face was a mask of absolute composure. The organ began to play. The guests turned toward the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom. The string quartet swelled. The flower girls prepared to walk. The ceremony was moments away from beginning. Then the doors burst open. Not the gentle, ceremonial push of a wedding entrance. The doors slammed against the interior walls with a sound like a gunshot, and every head in the ballroom snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. Adiz Nwosu stood in the doorway. She was not the quiet, modest assistant who had signed termination papers in a cream blouse 10 years ago. That woman was gone. The woman standing in the threshold of the Shilla Hotel's grand ballroom wore a deep emerald dress that hugged her frame with understated elegance. Her long black curls cascaded past her shoulders, partially gathered in an intricate Igbo braided style threaded with gold. Her skin glowed rich, deep brown, flawless under the crystal chandeliers. Gold earrings caught the light. Her warm brown eyes swept across the room with the calm authority of a woman who had survived things these guests could not imagine. She held a child's hand in each of hers. To her left stood Ease. 10 years old. Dark curly hair cut short. A sharp jawline already beginning to form. His small frame was still, almost unnervingly so, and his head tilted slightly to the side as he surveyed the ballroom with the same quiet, calculating gaze that every person in this room recognized, because they had seen it 1,000 times before. From the altar. To her right stood Amara. Also 10. Long dark curls woven into neat braids. Her mother's high cheekbones and warm smile softened a face that was otherwise unmistakably, undeniably Beck. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her dark gray eyes scanning the crowd with fearless curiosity. Both children had dark gray eyes. Almost silver in the chandelier light. Do-yoon's eyes. The ballroom went silent. Not the polite silence of a ceremony beginning. The suffocating, airless silence of 300 people realizing that something catastrophic had just occurred. Do-yoon did not move. He stood at the altar in his black tuxedo, his hands still clasped behind his back, and stared at the 2 children standing in the doorway of his wedding. His face did not change. His expression did not crack. But something behind his eyes, something buried so deep it had not surfaced in a decade, shifted violently like tectonic plates grinding beneath the earth. Ease tilted his head. He looked at Duyun the way Duyun looked at everything, with calm, silent assessment. The resemblance was not subtle. It was not gradual. It was immediate and devastating. The same gray eyes. The same stillness. The same way of folding into himself, of observing before reacting, of holding the entire room in his gaze without speaking a single word. Amara, bolder than her brother, took a half-step forward. Her small hand tightened around Adi's fingers. She looked up at the altar, at the man in the black tuxedo, and her expression softened into something that looked heartbreakingly like recognition, even though she had never met him. Seoul's champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor and exploded into 100 glittering pieces. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a second gunshot. No one moved to clean it up. Hae-sung, standing near the front row, felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the twins. He looked at Adi's. He looked at Duyun. And the memory surfaced, a memory from 10 years ago, of a young Nigerian woman who used to sit in the outer office translating documents, who was the only person in the building unafraid to meet Duyun's eyes, who had disappeared one rainy afternoon without explanation. He had not thought about her in years. Now he understood why she had left. Adiz walked forward. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm that cut through the silence like a metronome. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She walked down the center aisle of the wedding she had not been invited to, holding the hands of the children she had raised alone across 2 continents, and she did not flinch under the weight of 300 stares. She stopped 10 feet from the altar. She looked up at Duyun. Their eyes met. Warm brown against silver gray. Lagos against Seoul. 10 years of silence against 10 years of empire. The air between them was so charged it felt physical, like standing between 2 storms that had been building for a decade and had finally collided. Duyun's hands unclasped behind his back. His right hand, the one tattooed with loyal, dropped to his side. His fingers curled slightly, the knuckle ink catching the light. His jaw tightened. The dragon tattoo on his neck pulsed faintly beneath his collar as his pulse accelerated for the first time in years. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. Adiz held his gaze. Her expression was not angry. It was not vengeful. It was something far more dangerous than rage. It was calm. It was the composure of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side carrying 2 children on her back. She had not come here to destroy his wedding. She had not come here to humiliate him in front of his empire. She had come because she had no other choice. "I didn't come for you," she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, it carried to every corner. Her Nigerian accent was softer now, blended with years of international business, but the warmth in it was unmistakable. "I came because they are no longer safe." Duyun's eyes dropped to Ease. Then to Amara. Then back to Adiz. "Who?" he said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. Adiz's composure flickered. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Duyun to see the fear she had been carrying across 2 continents, the terror she had been hiding behind her elegance and her strength and her carefully constructed new life. "Ryu Sangcheo," she said. The name dropped into the ballroom like a bomb. Hae-sung stepped forward. Half the guests in the front row flinched. The Yoon patriarch, seated in the second row, set his drink down with a sharp clink and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Ryu Sangcheo. The rival syndicate leader who had been waging a shadow war against the Beck organization for 3 years. The man with the shaved head, the scar across his nose, and the reputation for destroying his enemies by targeting the things they loved most. Duyun's entire body went still. Not the controlled stillness of discipline. The frozen stillness of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is about to collapse. "He found out about them," Adiz continued, her voice dropping lower, her grip tightening on Ease and Amara's hands. 3 days ago. Men came to the school in Lagos. They asked questions. They took photographs." She paused. Her warm brown eyes locked onto Duyun's gray ones, and for the first time the composure cracked. "They know they are yours." Ease looked up at Duyun. His small face was calm, but his gray eyes, Duyun's eyes mirrored in a child's face, held a question he had clearly been carrying for a very long time. "Are you my father?" Ease asked. The words hung in the air. 300 guests held their breath. Seoul stood frozen near the altar, her ivory dress catching the chandelier light, her face pale with shock. Duyun looked down at the boy. At the girl. At the woman he had dismissed 10 years ago without a second glance. At the children he had never known existed. At the life he had unknowingly abandoned. And then the ballroom lights flickered. What? Twice. Every exit door slammed shut simultaneously, the locks engaging with a heavy metallic crash that echoed through the hall like a death sentence. Haesung's hand went to the inside of his jacket. His face went white. From the far corner of the ballroom, near the service entrance, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Shaved head. Heavy build. A scar cutting across the bridge of his nose like a crack in stone. Ryu Sangcheol smiled, revealing teeth that did not match the cold deadness in his narrow eyes. Behind him 6 armed men filed into the room. Sangcheol's gaze swept across the frozen wedding, past the shattered champagne glass, past the bride in her ivory dress, past the crime family patriarchs rising from their chairs in alarm. His eyes landed on Ise and Amara and his smile widened. "Congratulations, Deun," Sangcheol called out, his voice echoing through the ballroom like gravel dragged across steel. "I hear you just became a father." Adise pulled the twins behind her. Her body shielded theirs. Her eyes blazed. Deun stepped off the altar. The movement was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. Baek Deun simply stepped off the altar the way a man steps off a cliff, with full awareness that the ground below has disappeared and with absolute refusal to let the fall destroy the people standing beneath him. He crossed the 10 feet between the altar and Adise in 3 strides. His body positioned itself between the twins and Ryu Sangcheol's armed men before his conscious mind had finished processing the decision. His left hand, silence tattooed across the knuckles, reached behind him and closed around Ise's small shoulder. His right hand, loyal, extended toward Adise, not touching her, but hovering inches from her arm in a gesture so instinctive it startled them both. "Get behind me," he said. His voice had changed. The low, measured instrument of the boardroom was gone. What replaced it was something older, something that lived in the marrow of his bones, something that sounded like the back alleys of Busan where he had learned that survival was not a privilege but a practice. Adise did not argue. She pulled Ise and Amara behind Deun's broad frame, her hands gripping the twins' shoulders with a ferocity that spoke of 10 years of midnight terrors and whispered prayers in a Lagos apartment with barred windows. Sangcheol laughed. The sound was wet and ugly, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers like a stone skipping across glass. "Look at this," he said, spreading his arms wide. His leather coat creaked with the movement. The scar across his nose twisted as his smile deepened. The great Baek Deun. The man who feels nothing. The man who buried his past so deep he forgot it existed. He tilted his shaved head, his narrow eyes gleaming with predatory delight. "And yet here you are. Standing in front of 2 children you didn't know were alive 5 minutes ago, willing to die for them." He paused. How predictable. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Guests scrambled over chairs. The Yoon patriarch's bodyguards formed a perimeter around him, guns drawn. The string quartet abandoned their instruments and fled through a side door. White orchids were trampled underfoot. The shattered champagne glass near the altar caught the flickering chandelier light and glittered like scattered diamonds in the wreckage of what was supposed to be the most powerful union in Seoul's underworld. Haesung was already moving. He pulled a compact pistol from inside his jacket and fired a single warning shot into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. The screaming intensified, then abruptly stopped as every person in the room froze. "Nobody moves," Haesung said. His voice was calm, but the scar above his left eyebrow was white with tension. Behind him, a dozen of Deun's men materialized from the shadows of the ballroom's perimeter. They had been stationed there for the wedding security, and now their weapons were trained on Sangcheol's 6 gunmen with the precision of men who had done this many times before. The standoff crystallized. 12 guns against 6. Deun's men against Sangcheol's. The air smelled of gunpowder, expensive perfume and fear. Sangcheol's smile did not falter. He raised one hand and his men lowered their weapons slightly, not surrendering but signaling that this was not yet the moment for bloodshed. "I didn't come here to fight a war, Deun," Sangcheol said. "I came here to deliver a message." His eyes slid past Deun's shoulder and locked onto the twins. Ise stared back at him with those impossible gray eyes, unflinching, his small jaw set in an expression that was so painfully Deun's that Sangcheol's smile twitched. "Those children are your weakness. You spent 10 years building a fortress and you left the gate wide open without even knowing it." He took a step backward toward the service entrance. "I'll be in touch. And when I am, you will give me the Incheon ports, the Jeju shipping lanes and every Yoon territory south of the Han River. Or I will take the only things you have left to lose." He turned and disappeared through the service door. His men followed, melting into the shadows with the practiced efficiency of professionals who understood that a threat delivered cleanly was more devastating than a bullet fired in haste. The ballroom doors unlocked with a metallic clunk. Silence returned. But it was a different silence now, the hollow, ringing silence that follows an explosion. Diyun did not turn around. He stood with his back to Adiz and the twins, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. His tuxedo jacket strained across his shoulders. The dragon tattoo on his neck was fully visible now, his collar displaced by the sudden movement, the black and gray ink coiling against his skin like a living thing. "Clear the room," he said. His voice was barely audible, but Haesung heard it and immediately began directing the remaining guests toward the exits. The Yoon patriarch was escorted out by his bodyguards, his face purple with rage, his voice carrying fragments of threats about broken alliances and shattered contracts. The politicians vanished. The crime family representatives disappeared into the Seoul night like smoke. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was empty except for Dooyoon, Adiz, the twins, Haesung, and Seoa. Seoa stood near the altar in her ivory dress, her bare feet surrounded by the wreckage of her champagne glass. Her long straight black hair fell perfectly against her porcelain skin. Her expression was unreadable. She looked at Dooyoon's back. She looked at the woman and the two children standing behind him. She looked at the shattered remains of the wedding that was supposed to secure her family's future. Then she bent down, picked up a single white orchid from the trampled floor, and walked out of the ballroom without a word. Haesung lingered near the entrance, his eyes fixed on Dooyoon. "I'll secure the perimeter," he said quietly. "And I'll find out how Sang Cheol got this information." He paused. "Dooyoon?" Dooyoon did not respond. Haesung left. The ballroom doors closed. And then there were four. Dooyoon turned around slowly. The movement was deliberate, as though his body understood that rushing this moment would shatter something irreparable. He faced Adiz. He faced the twins. He looked at the three of them standing in the wreckage of his wedding, surrounded by crushed orchids and shattered glass, and the mask he had worn for 10 years, the cold, impenetrable mask of the most feared man in Seoul, cracked down the center like ice on a frozen river in spring. 10 years, he said. His voice broke on the second word. He did not try to hide it. 10 years, Adiz. Adiz lifted her chin. Her warm brown eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "You dismissed me without looking me in the eye. You handed me termination papers like I was a broken printer. You chose your empire over everything we had, and you did it on a Tuesday afternoon while it was raining." She swallowed. "I signed the papers. I walked out. And 2 days later, I found out I was carrying your children." Dion's breath hitched. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but in the vast emptiness of the ballroom it echoed like a confession. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. "Tell you what?" Adiz's composure fractured, and the pain of a decade poured through the cracks. "That I was pregnant with twins? That the man who had just discarded me like waste was about to become a father? You made your choice, Dion. You chose power. You chose silence. You chose the Beck name over every single thing we built in those stolen months together. What was I supposed to do? Call your office and leave a message with your secretary?" Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "I went home to Lagos. I raised them alone. Through sickness. Through poverty. Through nights when I didn't know if we would eat the next morning. I built a life from nothing while you built an empire from everything." Ease tugged gently on his mother's hand. His small face was calm, but his gray eyes, Dion's eyes, were wide with a confusion he was too young to fully articulate. "Mama," he said softly. "Is he the one?" Adiz closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, tracing a silver line down her deep brown cheek. "Yes, he is." Amara stepped forward. She released her mother's hand and walked toward Diyun with the fearless directness that had defined her since she was old enough to speak. She stopped in front of him, tilted her head back to look up at his face, and studied him with an intensity that made his chest ache. "You look like Ease," she said matter-of-factly, "but taller." Diyun looked down at his daughter. At her braided hair. At her mother's high cheekbones. At his own gray eyes staring back at him from a face that was half his and half the woman he had spent a decade trying to forget. His hands trembled. The man who controlled Seoul's underworld, who commanded armies of men who had stared down rival syndicate leaders without blinking, could not stop his hands from trembling. He knelt. Slowly, carefully, the knees of his tailored black tuxedo touching the marble floor amid the crushed orchids and broken glass. He lowered himself until he was at eye level with the twins, and for a long moment he simply looked at them. At Ease's quiet stillness. At Amara's bold curiosity. At the living, breathing proof of a life he had unknowingly abandoned. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was raw, stripped of every layer of control he had spent years constructing. "I swear to you. I didn't know." Ease tilted his head, that signature tilt, the one Duyun himself used when assessing a room, and studied the man kneeling before him. "Mama said you were busy," he said. "She said you had important work. She said you didn't know about us and that it wasn't your fault." He paused. "But I used to wonder." Duyun's throat tightened. "What did you wonder?" "Whether you would have wanted us," Yi said simply. "If you had known." The question hit Duyun with the force of a physical blow. His silver-gray eyes filled with tears he had not shed since he was a boy in Busan, since before the tattoos, before the empire, before the silence. He reached out, slowly giving Ease every opportunity to pull away, and placed his hand on the boy's cheek. His knuckle tattoos, loyal and silence, framed the child's face like a broken prayer. "Every day," Duyun whispered. "If I had known, I would have burned this entire city to the ground before I let you grow up without me." Amara reached out and wrapped her small fingers around Duyun's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Adiz watched from a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, her emerald dress catching the dim chandelier light. Her expression was a war between the mother who wanted her children to have a father and the woman who remembered exactly what it felt like to be discarded by this man. She did not move closer. She did not soften. Not yet. The wounds were too deep, the years too long, the trust too thoroughly destroyed. But she did not walk away. The next 48 hours were a blur of controlled chaos. Duyun relocated Adiz and the twins to a fortified penthouse in Gangnam, a residence he had never used, hidden behind layers of security that even Haesung had to be briefed on. Mrs. Adeyemi, who had flown in from Lagos with Adiz and was currently staying in a nearby hotel, arrived within the hour, her colorful Ankara dress a vivid splash of warmth against the penthouse's cold minimalist interior. She took one look at Duyun, sized him up with the practiced eye of a woman who had raised children through war and famine, and said, "You have a lot of making up to do." Duyun nodded. "I know." Mrs. Adeyemi sniffed. "Knowing and doing are different things, Mr. Beck." She turned and ushered the twins into the kitchen, where she began preparing jollof rice with ingredients she had somehow managed to source from a Nigerian market in Itaewon within hours of landing in Seoul. The smell of tomato, thyme and Scotch bonnet peppers filled the penthouse, and for the first time in 10 years, the space felt like something other than a fortress. Duyun stood in the living room, watching through the kitchen doorway as Yi sat at the counter doing homework in Korean while Amara helped Mrs. Adeyemi stir the pot, chattering in a mixture of English and Igbo that Duyun could not understand but found himself desperate to learn. Adiz stood by the window, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent as she spoke with her business partners in Lagos, managing the empire she had built while he had been busy forgetting her name. He watched her. He watched the way her long black curls caught the Seoul city lights. He watched the way her hand moved to her stomach when she was stressed, the same gesture she had made 10 years ago in his office, the one he had missed, the one that haunted him now with the weight of everything he had failed to see. Haesung arrived at midnight with intelligence that made the blood freeze in Duyun's veins. "Seoul has mobilized," Haesung said, his voice tight. "He's pulled men from his Busan operations. He's hired mercenaries from the mainland. He knows the twins are in Gangnam, and he's planning to move within the next 24 hours. He placed a surveillance photograph on the table. It showed Ease and Amara outside their school in Lagos, taken 3 days ago from across the street. The image was grainy, but the children's faces were unmistakable. He wants them alive, Duyun. That's worse than the alternative. Alive means leverage. Alive means he can use them to strip you of everything. Duyun stared at the photograph. His hands curled into fists. The knuckle tattoos flexed, loyal silence, and the dragon on his neck seemed to coil tighter against his skin. "He won't touch them," Duyun said. His voice was no longer broken. It was no longer raw. It had returned to the low, terrifying calm that preceded violence, the stillness that Haesung had learned to recognize as the most dangerous sound in the world. "Tell the Yoon patriarch the alliance is dissolved." Haesung blinked. "Duyun. The Yoon ports. The Jeju shipping lanes. If you dissolve the alliance now, you lose half your territorial control. Seoul will. I don't care." Duyun's gray eyes lifted from the photograph, and the look in them made Haesung take an involuntary step backward. "I spent 10 years building an empire to protect a future I thought was empty. The future is not empty. It has my children's faces. Dissolve the alliance. Pull every man from the Incheon operations. I want a perimeter around this building that nothing can penetrate. And I want Sangcheol's location by dawn. Haesung stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. It's done. He left. Doyoon stood alone in the living room, the surveillance photograph still on the table, the smell of jollof rice drifting from the kitchen, the sound of Amara's laughter echoing down the hallway. He pressed his palms flat against the table and bowed his head, and the weight of 10 years of absence crashed down on him with a force that nearly brought him to his knees. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their first days of school. He had missed the nights Adiz had stayed awake with feverish infants in a Lagos apartment with no air conditioning and no help. He had missed the birthdays, the milestones, the quiet moments of ordinary life that he had traded for power and territory and a throne built on silence. He could not get those years back. But he could make sure there were no more years lost. The attack came at 3 a.m. Doyoon was awake. He had not slept. He was standing by the penthouse window watching the Seoul skyline, when the first explosion rocked the building's ground floor. The lights died. Emergency red lighting flooded the corridors. The sound of gunfire erupted from the stairwell, sharp, controlled bursts that spoke of professional mercenaries, not street thugs. Haesung's voice crackled through the earpiece. They're in the building. 3rd floor. Moving up. Doyoon was already moving. He sprinted down the hallway to the twins' room, threw open the door, and found Adiz already there, her body curled around Ease and Amara in the corner, her eyes wide but her voice steady as she whispered to them in Igbo. Mrs. Adeyemi stood by the door with a fire extinguisher in her hands and an expression of absolute defiance on her face. Stay here, Doyoon said to Adiz. His voice was calm. His eyes were not. Do not open this door for anyone except me or Haesung. Adiz grabbed his arm. Her grip was fierce, her nails digging into the fabric of his shirt. Doyoon? Her voice broke. Don't you dare die. Don't you dare leave them again. He looked at her. At the woman he had dismissed. At the mother who had raised his children across an ocean. At the only person in the world who had ever looked him in the eye and made him feel something he could not control. I'm coming back, he said. All of us. He pulled away and stepped into the hallway. The next 11 minutes were a blur of violence that Doyoon would later describe to Haesung in 3 words. It is finished. He moved through the building with the lethal precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for moments exactly like this. His tuxedo jacket was gone. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the full sleeves of black and gray tattoos. The Korean tiger, the mountain landscape, the prayer beads, the calligraphy reading Blood Remembers. The dragon on his neck was fully exposed, coiling against his skin like a war banner. He found Sangcheol on the penthouse stairwell, surrounded by the last 3 of his mercenaries. The rival syndicate leader's leather coat was torn, his scarred face slick with sweat, his eyes wild with the desperate fury of a man who realized his plan was collapsing in real time. Where are the children? Sangcheol snarled, pulling a knife from his belt. Give me the children and I'll let you keep the ports. Doyoon did not speak. He did not negotiate. He did not offer terms or counteroffers or strategic compromises. He simply walked forward, and the violence that followed was swift, precise, and absolute. When it was over, Sangcheol lay on the stairwell floor, broken and unconscious, his knife embedded in the wall 3 feet from where his hand had been. His remaining men had fled. Haesung's team secured the building within minutes. Doyoon stood in the stairwell, breathing hard, his knuckles split, his shirt torn, the tattoos on his arms glistening with sweat and blood that was not entirely his own. He looked down at Sangcheol's unconscious body and felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Only the overwhelming, desperate need to return to the room where his children were waiting. He walked back down the hallway. He opened the door. Adiz was standing in the center of the room, the twins behind her, her arms spread wide as though she had been prepared to physically shield them with her body. When she saw him, alive, standing, whole, her composure finally, completely, irrevocably shattered. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pressed her face against his chest. Her hands gripped the torn fabric of his shirt. Her body shook with sobs she had been holding back for 10 years. Doyoon wrapped his arms around her, around the woman he had lost, the woman he had found, the woman who had raised his children with a strength he could never have matched, and he held her as though the world outside this room had ceased to exist. Ease and Amara stood by the bed, watching. Ease's gray eyes were wide. Amara's lower lip trembled. Then Amara walked forward, tugged on Doyoon's sleeve and said, Appa, is the bad man gone? The word hit him like a bullet to the chest. Appa. Father. Dad. He dropped to his knees again, not in the ballroom this time, not amid shattered glass and crushed orchids, but in a quiet room in Gangnam with his daughter's hand in his and his son watching from the doorway and the woman he loved holding his face in her hands. "Yes," he whispered. His voice cracked. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked, unashamed. "The bad man is gone. And he is never coming back." Amara threw her arms around his neck. Ease followed a moment later, his small body pressing against Duyun's side with a quiet trust that took more courage than any battle Duyun had ever fought. Adiz knelt beside them. Her deep brown skin glowed in the red emergency light. Her long black curls fell around her face like a curtain. Her warm brown eyes met Duyun's gray ones, and the distance between them, 10 years, 2 continents, 1,000 unspoken wounds, finally, slowly began to close. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Duyun said. His voice was barely audible over the sound of the twins breathing against his chest. "I don't deserve it. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve them. But I am asking for the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that I understand what I lost." Adiz studied his face. She looked at the tears on his cheeks. She looked at the blood on his knuckles. She looked at the way his arms held their children as though he would tear the sky apart before letting them go. She thought about the 10 years of loneliness. The nights in Lagos when the rain hammered against the tin roof and she whispered his name into the darkness even though she had sworn she never would. The way Ease used to stare at Korean men on television with a quiet longing he tried to hide. The way Amara used to ask why their father's eyes looked like theirs. She thought about all of it. And then she placed her hand over his, her warm brown fingers covering his tattooed knuckles, loyal in silence, and she said, "You don't get to disappear again." "Never," Duyun said. "You don't get to choose power over us. Never. You don't get to sign a piece of paper and walk away. Never." His voice broke completely. "I will burn every paper, every contract, every empire I have ever built before I let you walk out of my life again." Adiz closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek and landed on their joined hands. "Then stay," she whispered. Dawn broke over Seoul 3 hours later, painting the skyline in shades of gold and rose. The emergency lights had been replaced by the soft morning sun streaming through the penthouse windows. The city below was waking up, unaware that the most powerful alliance in its underworld had dissolved overnight, that a rival syndicate leader was in police custody, and that the feared Baek Diyun was sitting on the floor of a children's bedroom with jollof rice stains on his torn shirt and 2 sleeping twins in his arms. Mrs. Adeyemi brought tea. She set the tray down, looked at the scene before her and smiled. "About time," she said and walked out. Haesung called to confirm that the Yoon patriarch had accepted the dissolution of the alliance with surprising grace. Seoul, he reported, had sent a single message, "Take care of them." Duyun read the message and felt a flicker of respect for the woman he had almost married, a woman who had understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to be a pawn in someone else's game. The morning light grew stronger. Ease stirred in Duyun's left arm, his gray eyes opening slowly, his head tilting as he registered where he was. Amara mumbled something in Igbo in her sleep and burrowed deeper into Duyun's right shoulder. Adiz sat across from him, her legs crossed, her emerald dress wrinkled, her gold earrings still catching the light. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful. She looked like the future he had almost destroyed and the past he had almost forgotten and the present he was finally, desperately learning to hold. Duyun looked at her. At the twins. At the family he had not known he had and could no longer imagine living without. He made a vow. Not in a ballroom. Not in front of 300 guests. Not for political advantage or territorial gain. He made it quietly in a sunlit room in Gangnam, with the smell of jollof rice lingering in the air and the sound of his children breathing against his chest. "I, Baek Diyun, give you my life," he said. His voice was steady now. Certain. Stripped of everything except truth. Not my empire. Not my name. My life. To you Adiz Nwosu. To Ease. To Amara. From this morning until my last breath. No conditions. No contracts. No silence. I am yours. I have always been yours. I was too blind to see it, too afraid to admit it, and too proud to fight for it. But I see it now. And I will spend every remaining day making sure you never have to wonder again. Adiz's breath caught. Her warm brown eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of grief. They were tears of recognition. Of healing. Of a woman who had carried the weight of 2 worlds on her shoulders for a decade and was finally being met with a love equal to her sacrifice. She leaned forward. She placed her forehead against his. Her curls mingled with his slicked back hair. Her breath warmed his skin. "Then we begin," she whispered. Today. Together. Ease opened his eyes fully and looked up at both of them. His gray eyes, Dion's eyes, were calm, observant, and for the first time in his young life, completely at peace. Appa, he said softly. Can we have breakfast? Dion laughed. The sound was unfamiliar, rusty, almost foreign in his own throat. But it was real. It was genuine. It was the sound of a man who had spent 10 years in silence and had finally found the one thing worth breaking it for. Yes, he said, pulling his children closer, his arms wrapping around the family he had almost lost before he ever knew they existed. We can have anything you want. Outside the penthouse windows, Seoul glittered in the morning light. The Shilla Hotel stood in the distance, its grand ballroom still littered with crushed orchids and shattered glass, the remnants of a wedding that never happened and an alliance that no longer mattered. The underworld would talk. The crime families would recalibrate. The power structures of the city would shift and realign in the weeks to come. But none of that reached the quiet room on the 42nd floor, where a feared mafia boss sat on the floor with jollof rice on his shirt and tears on his face and his children in his arms, holding the woman who had raised them alone across an ocean, making a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. The wedding was supposed to secure his future. Instead, the woman who walked through those ballroom doors with his twins gave him something no alliance, no empire, and no amount of power could ever provide. She gave him a family. And this time he would not let go.